Hey you guys, welcome back to the channel where we review anything and everything. Now, today we're going to get into actually just a basics on how to play chess. Now, recently I just picked up and purchased this set along with this one over here, which I did a video review on both of these sets. So, in light of those two videos, I just wanted to make a video just going over some of the basics for those who are not familiar with chess, and obviously for those who are, they don't even have to waste their time with this video because you're already going to know way more than even I know about chess. This is just going to go over the basics in terms of the pieces and how each piece moves, um, and also what it means to castle or castling, what that maneuver means. In addition, though, recently, actually, I found out about another less common maneuver that I'm not going to really too much go over right now because in this video, because I don't know it that well, but it's something called like a pass through or something. Anyone's familiar with that in the comments can kind of explain it a little better. But I'm not gonna go through the process of mentioning it because I know that it's actually something that I've never heard of before because it's not very common, and I think it's a little overcomplicated for people who are beginners. As I just found out about it recently when I was playing chess on my phone against the computer. So, and the computer did it to me. But anyway, so let's jump into this. First off, we're going to go over all of the pieces. Now, in my reviews, I went over this set and all of the pieces at that time. But being that this video, some people might come to it for the first time, and obviously this is going to be a video about teaching the basics of chess. We're going to go over all of those pieces again. So here we have the pawn all in the front row. And we're going to go over all the names of the pieces first, and then we're going to come back around to each piece to say what each one does. And I want to apologize in advance for the fact that I'm a little bit under the weather. So this is the pawn. This right here is the rook. This is the knight. This is the bishop. This is the king. This is the queen. And then obviously it repeats on the other side. Now, for this set here, the king and the queen seem a little less distinguishable from each other as they would normally on other sets. But just know in this case, this is the king and this is the queen. On most sets, the king and the queen will have more of like a big crown going around this area, and the king will have a little cross on the top of his crown because it's considered his crown or his hat, whatever you want to call it, similar to how like someone at a church would have with the crown on the, I mean, with the cross on the top. So just so you guys don't get confused in the way the king and the queen normally look. Matter of fact, I'm going to show you on this smaller set, which has more traditional the way that the king is, but less for the queen. So there goes what king traditionally looks. The queen in this set looks very similar to the one you see there. So just wanted to point that out really quick. Now, so let's get into the movement of the pieces and what the pieces are able to do. So the pawn, what you see here, is generally able to make two types of movements in the beginning and only in the beginning. So on its starting line, it could either move one space or it could have jumped two spaces. But any turn after that, it can only move one space in a forward direction. So if you started here, on your next turn, you can move here. You can't go sideways, you can't go diagonal, and you can't go backwards. Pawns can only move forward. Now, if you had a situation where you came up to a pawn or any other piece in front of you, you cannot attack that piece going forward. You can only move forward with a pawn, but you can only jump a piece or attack a piece moving diagonal, not sideways, but diagonal. So in a situation where you are like this pawn cannot do anything, nor can the black pawn do anything. Now, if a pawn was here or any other piece was here, he could jump it diagonally, and that would be the only action that he could take in that situation, because he's blocked off from what's in front of him. And the only thing that gives him permission to move sideways is to attack another piece. Now, if this piece wasn't here, he essentially would be stuck and he can't move. He threatens both of these squares on the side, but he cannot move anywhere. Just to be clear with that. Now, if you had the pawn here and an opposing pawn was they both were threatening each other in an attacking position, this pawn here has the option to move forward, or he can jump because there's no one in front of him. So he has the option to move forward, or he has the option to jump the other player. He doesn't have the option, obviously, to move diagonal here, like I mentioned before, or move sideways, just to be clear. And that pretty much, for the most part, wraps up the pawn, aside from one factor, which is not something you would ever address in the beginning aspects of the game. But if your pawn is able to make it to one of the final squares, let's assume that all the pieces are cleared out the way. There's a clear line for the pawn to make it through, and he makes it here. You could say, queen me is usually sometimes what people say because they go after the queen, but essentially you can change your piece for any other piece, obviously, instead of another pawn, but you would be able to change your piece into any other piece and not obviously a second king. Most of the time, 99% of the time, someone's going to take a queen. Now, my understanding now for things is you can have two queens. And not to say that ever wasn't the case in the past, but most sets back in the days, this set is not on that, doesn't have that premium aspect of having two queens. But generally speaking, you would back in the days when we used to play, because there was only just a set for each piece and no additional queens, most of the time you would have lost your queen by the time you actually get a pawn to get the other side. But obviously, if you have something to represent a queen, an additional queen, if your queen isn't lost yet, you can get a second queen. Or some sets nowadays that are at least about $20 or more will probably have a second queen. So with that being the case, just like, for example, my travel set, which I reviewed on the channel, comes with a second queen. So, and the reason for that is because typically you're only going to be able to get one pawn across to the side, and you're going to almost always choose the queen to be the piece that you take when you upgrade your pawn. So that's why most sets now include an extra queen. Though you can take any other piece, it just wouldn't make sense. Just so you understand that for newcomers to the game, you would never take another piece that's not a queen, because the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. Now, that is for the pawns. Now let's jump into the rook. So the rook essentially can move all the way in a straight line forward and back. So he can turn back. So one thing I'm going to get out the way from the beginning, all these pieces on the back are able to move backwards on the board, where pawns can only move forward. So just so you know, and I will have to reiterate that later on, all these other pieces can move backwards. So if he was here, he can move forward, he can move backward all the way until he hits another piece, and I'll explain how that works afterwards. He can also move side to side all the way. So if he's here on the board, he can go all the way to the other side, just like that. Now, he's considered to be, besides your queen, probably your second most powerful piece. Though, sometimes it could be considered just whatever your position is, but generally speaking, it's considered to be probably your second most powerful piece outside of the queen. Now, the way he works in terms of attacking, and most pieces move in the same way that they attack, other than the pawn. The pawn is the only one who moves forward but can only attack diagonal. Most pieces will attack in the same way that they move, so you don't have to kind of worry about that or get confused with that. So the rook, if a pawn, say, was in front of him or any obstacles in front of him, he would just move forward. He would take that piece as far as him attacking them, and then that would just be how that goes there. Same if someone is over here, he would just slide over and then he takes them, and that's his attack right there. So his movement and attack is the same. Once again, he can go all the way straight, he can go all the way sideways, and that is how the rook works. In addition, this goes without saying, but if he was in this location right here, then essentially he is threatening all of this on this entire row, and he's threatening everything in this entire lane right here going up and down. So that's his threat area and how the rook operates. Next, I'm going to actually go into the bishop, and the reason why is because he's actually very similar to the rook, so I think it's easier to explain him next coming from the rook. So the bishop is able to move diagonal, where the rook can move straight and sideways on straight lines. The bishop can only move diagonal. He can never move forward or backwards in a straight line at all. So he's always diagonal. But he goes all the way, just like the rook, all the way diagonal like that. So essentially, he's your counterpart to the rook. Now, because he moves in a diagonal line, and diagonal will maintain the same color, meaning that he's on the black squares, and right here, your other bishop is on the white squares. He starts on the white squares. The white squared bishop, we'll say, is always on the white squares, and the black square bishop is always on the black squares. For both sides, it doesn't matter. They're going to be the same. And so they'll never leave that. So that's something to note, because those are always going to be within their lines. The only squares they're able to threaten is that color. So once you lose your black squared bishop, you can never threaten a black square with your other bishop ever again. So that goes into more of, strategy aspects. When you get down the line, you start being familiar with the game, but just understand those pieces will always remain on the same square, just on the base of the mechanics of how it works moving diagonal. Now, they essentially will jump their target the exact same way as I just mentioned for the rook, where they would slide across and they would jump in the same way they move. So that is how you would attack a piece, regardless of their positioning. You're here, you move, you attack the piece. So that's how they go. It's pretty simple once you understand the bishop and you understand the rook. They're pretty simple. Now we're going to go into the knight, and the knight is actually a little bit more complicated. So the knight the knight can move in an L shape. So generally speaking, and I'm starting them off here to show you clearly, don't think that they can just move into these places. Obviously, you got to get past your pawns. Normally speaking, your bishop and your rook have to get past your pawn. So if you were moving, you'd have to get your pawn up out of the way, then you'd move your rook, and then you'd get them to the side, and you'd kind of get out there onto the field. That applies to all the pieces except for the knight. Now, the knight can only move in an L shape. I'll tell you how it's able to pass his pawns in a moment. But just going off of the way that the shaping is, the knight is able to make an L shape of 2 squares in one direction and 1 square in a adjacent direction. So 1, 2, and then 1. That's the L shape. Or he can go 1 square this way and then 2 that way to form an L shape. So it's always an L shape. Any combination you could think of an L shape is the way he can go. Now, the knight can actually pass through other pieces. Its movement is not even optional to not pass through other pieces. So when you do the L shape, in this case, 2 forward and 1 to the side, or 1 to the side that way, he's skipping over his pawns. He's cutting right through all of that. He can only jump a piece by landing in his landing spot, not through his movement. So the same way he cuts through his own pieces, he cuts through the enemy's pieces. But also be mindful to know that that means that he is only able to land or threaten a square that he can land on. So in this case right now, in this little setup you see right here, the knight cannot attack either one of these pawns because the full L shape would bring him here, or he could go here. He could go here, which sets him up for an attack to then go here. But you see how he has to land on the same square of the one he's attacking. So as I mentioned before about characters who have the same movement as they do attacking, the knight is within that realm of the way he moves is also the way he attacks, unlike the pawn. The only difference is he doesn't have, I guess, a pathway in his movement is also part of what he threatens. Unlike the bishop or the rook, the path he can move on is not threatened by his movement, only the square that he lands on. So just to understand that. What makes him very unique is that, like I just mentioned before, the fact that he can pass through threats means that sometimes he can get around to places that others can't. Like, for example, if the knight is here on the board, he now has the ability to get past these pawns and either take the bishop or he could take the rook. But yet the bishop or the rook cannot do anything to him, nor can they get out of the way. Now, granted, if he makes that jump, he will be vulnerable in a certain situation. Here, he could take the rook and there's nothing to threaten him. But if instead he went and took the bishop, he would then obviously be set up to be jumped by the king. But the point in that was just to show you that your initial wall of defense, the pawns, the knight is able to cut through them. And then we're going to go back to a concept or really elaborate on the strengths and weaknesses of the wall of the pawns after I finish what all the pieces can do in their movement. So next comes the queen. Now, with the queen, she's able to move in any square, sliding across any distance until she runs into a piece that she is able to attack if she chooses to. So essentially what the queen is the queen is actually the combined abilities of the rook and the bishop. So the same way the rook can go as many squares forward and as many squares sideways, forward and back or sideways, and the bishop can go as many squares diagonal in any way that it chooses to do. The queen is able to go as many squares diagonal, as many squares sideways, or forward and back. So that makes the queen the most valuable piece and the ultimate piece on the board, which is the very reason why I mentioned in the beginning. If you made it to the other side with your pawn, you're going to ask to be queened rather than, trade for a rook or bishop or anything of that sort, or knight, because the queen is essentially the most powerful piece in the game. With that being said, also mind you that if you lose your queen, the chances of you winning drop considerably unless you're an expert player, because your queen is that valuable. Your queen, literally, most people would agree, is probably at least the value of 2 rooks, which, like I said, is probably the second most valuable piece inside the game. Easily more valuable than more valuable than 2 bishops, more valuable than probably 2 bishops and a knight. The queen is very valuable. So with that being said, you definitely don't want to lose her. You don't want to just trade pieces for her. That term simply means, if somebody else's bishop, obviously these 2 bishops come from a different color, so they wouldn't be the same space. But just for example, say if you took someone's bishop and then you knew afterwards, like, you were about to get jumped and then they take your bishop, that's called trading pieces. You're like, I'll take your bishop if I get to get your bishop as well. But your queen is not something that you want to do that with unless you're specifically trading your queen for their queen. Then it cancels out. Otherwise, you trade your queen for any other piece, you're losing out on that. So that's the movement of the queen. Now the king, which obviously if somebody threatens the king, that's when they say check, because the king, if he gets defeated, you lose the game. Now, so just to give that example, if the king is right here and someone, now it's their turn, and well, they just finished moving their turn and they say check because the pawn can jump diagonally. Check means that your king is threatened. Your king cannot be killed or otherwise you lose the game. With that being said, the king's movement can go all the same directions as the queen, but one step instead of sliding all the way. He can only make one movement, but he can go in any direction that he wants to go. Now, the reason why I first start off with saying to you that the whole check thing and the value of the king is because, unlike the rest of the pieces I just mentioned, where you would use them to go on the offense, the king is not someone you want to go on the offense with. He is definitely a powerful piece in his own right, being that he can move in any direction. But unfortunately, because he can't move many squares, his movement really is just for him to protect himself as he tries to get out of there. You wouldn't primarily use him for offense, because if you did and your enemy kept catching you in places, say if you were here and they have their knight here and it's like check. And then so now you have to, we'll say the setup is like this. And he moves the knight here and he goes check. And your king now is threatened. You might move here and then he can just go check. And now you have to keep trying to move your king away. And because of that, any other piece that you might have that might get jumped now is just vulnerable to get jumped, to get attacked, because you have to move your king to safety, because otherwise you lose the game. So that's not an option for you not to move your king. So I say that to say, first and foremost, don't use your king in an offensive way unless you're that good. But with that being said, now I want to go double back on what I mentioned before about the whole thing with the wall of pawns. So for anyone who's kind of new to chess and learning this, the pawns are supposed to be your wall of protection. And when you're new, that is a good thing. When you're brand new and you're fighting someone or you're battling someone who is also new, you could see the pawns as a form of protection. They're your wall to protect all your top strong pieces, and that is supposed to be a positive thing. But once you start to get to a more expert level, your pawns actually, you start realizing, are blocking all your movement of your better pieces. And what most experts then try to do is use your wall. And I'm not trying to go into expert talk, just basic talk, but I just want players to understand the pros and cons of this simple line right here of pawns. They are your protection, but I'm sure you heard the saying before, if you build a fortress too good, you also keep yourself in, besides for not letting other people in, you keep yourself from getting out. So that's essentially what happens here with your defensive pawns. So as you move your pieces, you're also giving yourself access to get out of your own way. You see here, you're able to start moving your pieces, and now you can start getting your pieces out from behind the wall of pawns. And essentially, while your opponent's going to do the same, if you don't get some of these pawns clear at a reasonable time, what you could find yourself in a situation of is where, let's just say, they've got some of their pieces out. They happen to have, maybe their queen comes around, something like that. And they're in a situation where, they're able to, get behind your enemy lines. This is not a complete correct setup, because obviously you'd have your queen here to defend you. But the point I'm trying to display here is that in a situation where you're caged into your own space, what ends up happening sometimes is when you can't get out, you're in a situation now where your king is threatened, but you can't go anywhere. Obviously here you'd have a situation where you could protect with your bishop or your queen. But I'm just trying to display the concept that your own pawns can be your own wall that you can't get out of. And then at that point, you actually end up hurting yourself, the fact that you can't get through your own pawns. So hopefully, though that demonstration setup wasn't completely showing of that, you understand the concept that I'm trying to tell you. And that's pretty much the basics of chess. From that point on, you just get used to kind of running your game however you would do. You know, you start picking up on little strategies that you can play that work for your benefit versus, what you think doesn't. You just get kind of used to your own things. Um, that's just for the basics. Like I said, as time goes on, you start realizing certain patterns, certain maneuvers, certain ways that you first start moving your pawns to get your back row out better, more efficiently, depending on what you want to go with, different strategies. And it becomes a whole long game of you just trying to figure out and memorizing over time your best little strategies that work for you to get yourself going. And that's on the basic level. We're not even going to get into the deeper levels where certain pros start memorizing the entire board and all the possibilities that could go down before they even happen. But just on that basic level, you're just trying to at least just figure out on a basic level of strategy what pieces you're going to move, what's your plan in terms of what pieces do you favor and which ones do you want out there to be able to do your attacking. So hopefully that helped you guys for getting started off with just learning chess. And as always, like, share, comment, subscribe. I'll catch you guys in the next video.